Have you ever wondered what it feels like to always be the kind one, but never the chosen one? Charlotte was that woman. Raised in a small Missouri town where being gentle was expected, but being seen was rare. Her father died young. Her mother stitched dresses for other people's dreams. And Charlotte. She lived quietly with a camera in her hand and a heart full of questions. Then came the day she left it all behind. A one-way ticket to Denver. No plan, just a scholarship, an old suitcase, and the silent ache of wanting more. What would you do if someone looked at you, really saw you not for your beauty, not for what you could offer, but simply for who you were? Would you trust it, or would you run the way life taught you to? This isn't a story about perfect love. It's about real love, the kind that waits, stays, and holds space for your healing. If you find this story touching, comment 1. If you think this video needs improvement, comment 2. Now, let us take you to a snowy cabin in Colorado, where a woman with a pure heart finally hears the words she was never told: "You're enough, just as you are." The flames crackled in the old stone fireplace, painting slow-moving shadows across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind howled gently through the pine trees, dusting the windows with soft layers of snow. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the steady rhythm of the fire and the quiet breath of two people sitting just far enough apart to feel the distance and just close enough to feel everything. Charlotte Hayes sat on the edge of a plaid blanket-covered sofa, her fingers trembling lightly as she clutched a mug of steaming tea. Her voice came out soft, almost like she was speaking to the fire itself. "Go slow. I'm a pure-hearted girl." The words hovered in the room like a fragile feather caught in still air. And then silence. Miles Anderson didn't move. He only looked at her with those steady, deep eyes of his, not surprised, not judging, just listening, seeing. But before anything else could be said, the story spun backward, like a reel, rewinding not to erase, but to remember, because that night, that moment hadn't come from nowhere. It had started long before, in a different place, under a quieter sky. It was 2 months earlier, the first time Charlotte set foot in the small mountain town nestled just south of Denver. Her worn camera bag bounced against her hip as she pushed open the heavy glass door of a little cafe near the base of the Rockies. A hand-painted sign hung above the entry, Pine and Steam. The scent of roasted beans and warm cinnamon greeted her like a long-lost friend. She was cold, tired, and a little lost, both in directions and in life. There weren't many people inside. A man at the far corner sat alone by the window, nursing a black coffee and scribbling something into a leather-bound notebook. She wouldn't have noticed him at all if it weren't for one thing: the way he looked up the moment she walked in. It wasn't the kind of glance people give strangers. It wasn't a stare. It was more like recognition, like he'd seen her before or had been waiting to. Charlotte pretended not to notice, choosing a seat near the opposite window, closer to the heater. Her fingers ached from the mountain cold, and she rubbed them together before pulling out her journal. But her thoughts weren't with her pages. They hovered back across the room where he was. She peeked again. He wasn't writing anymore, just watching the snow fall. Charlotte had never considered herself remarkable. She wasn't loud or flashy or the kind of woman people remembered in crowds. She liked old books, quiet mornings, and photographing things most people overlooked, like cracked sidewalks and the way light hit broken glass. Her last boyfriend had once said, "You're sweet, Charlotte, but maybe too soft for me. Too soft, too gentle, too pure-hearted." She learned early that some people liked stormy hearts. And she was more like rain after a drought. First time up here, the voice pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked up, Startled, the man from the corner had walked over, holding his coffee. He stood a respectful distance away, not too close, not too confident. "Yes," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Just moved in 2 days ago." He nodded, then gestured to the empty chair across from her. "May I?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." When he sat, the silence wasn't awkward. It was gentle. "I'm Miles," he said, offering a simple smile. "Charlotte." They shook hands. His were warm, not soft, but not rough either. Hands of someone who worked, but also knew how to hold something carefully. Over the next 20 minutes, their conversation drifted like falling snow. Slow, effortless, unhurried. They talked about the light that day, about how the mountains made everything feel smaller but safer. He asked about her camera, and she spoke of her dream to photograph the changing seasons in quiet places, places that don't beg to be seen, but deserve to be remembered. And then he said something that made her heart pause. "I think some people are like that too." She looked at him, not loud, not asking for attention, but somehow unforgettable. Charlotte didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken like that to her, not without expecting something in return. That night, she returned to her small studio apartment in the city. The radiator rattled, the lights flickered once, and the floor creaked under her tired steps. But inside her mind, it wasn't the room she lived in that played on repeat. It was the cafe, the snowfall, and the quiet man with eyes that didn't just look, they saw. She didn't know it yet, but a seed had been planted that afternoon, a silent understanding, the kind that doesn't grow fast but grows deep. The first snowfall she'd ever seen came when she was 11, and it barely lasted the afternoon, just a light dusting on the front porch, enough to gather in her hands before it melted into her skin, but she never forgot the feeling quiet, gentle, fleeting. That's how she remembered her father. Charlotte Hayes grew up in the kind of town that didn't change. Mapleton, Missouri, population under 2,000, a 2-pump gas station, a diner that closed at 4 p.m., and streets so quiet at night you could hear dogs barking 3 blocks over. Her father died when she was 13. It was quick a heart attack on a Sunday morning while fixing the neighbor's fence. 1 minute he was there, wearing his usual flannel, grinning at her with paint on his nose, and the next, he wasn't. After that, the world grew smaller. Her mother, a quiet woman with strong hands and tired eyes, took a job at Stitch and Bloom, the only tailor shop in town. She hemmed wedding dresses and mended farm overalls with equal grace, but it never paid much. They got by, just barely. Charlotte learned early to shrink herself to take up less space, need fewer things, and never ask for too much. She was the kind of girl who remembered birthdays, who offered to help without being asked, who always said thank you. And yet, somehow, never the girl anyone stayed for. In high school, she watched her friends fall in love with boys who played guitar or broke the rules or said things that made their hearts race. Charlotte. She was the one they confided in. The good girl, the safe space, the friend, sweet, kind, a little invisible. She never complained. But sometimes, late at night, lying in her narrow bed under the hum of the ceiling fan, she would whisper into the darkness, "When will someone choose me? Not because I'm easy to talk to or convenient, but because they can't imagine life without me." Photography started as a way to escape. Her dad's old film camera sat untouched on the shelf for years. One day, she dusted it off, loaded a roll of expired black and white, and went outside. She didn't shoot faces. She shot forgotten things, cracked window frames, Mailboxes leaning sideways, rain puddles that held entire sunsets in them. Her teachers saw something in those photos. Then came a recommendation, a submission, a letter, a full scholarship to the Rocky Mountain School of the Arts, Denver. It didn't feel real until the envelope arrived. Her mom cried, half joy, half fear. "You'll be so far away." Charlotte smiled gently. Not too far, just far enough to see what else is out there. She left on a Thursday morning in early October. The bus station was small, no overhead speakers, just a whiteboard listing departure times. Her mother stood in a tan coat that didn't quite fit anymore, holding a thermos of sweet tea and trying not to cry. Charlotte carried a single duffel and her father's camera, wrapped in his old denim jacket. As the Greyhound pulled away, she pressed her forehead to the window. The streets of Mapleton blurred into gold and green fields, then into empty plains. Her chest ached, not from regret, but from the weight of every small goodbye she didn't know how to say. I always lived right. But will anyone ever live for me? That thought lingered in the cold air between her and the window. The trip to Denver took 14 hours with stops. She didn't sleep. She just watched the world change outside flatter, then higher. Dry grass turned to red earth, then gave way to pine trees and peaks that touched the sky. It was breathtaking and terrifying. She arrived in the city just after sunset. The lights overwhelmed her. Cars moved like they had somewhere to be. People didn't make eye contact. Everything felt taller, louder, harder. Charlotte walked out of the terminal into air that smelled of exhaust and early snow, gripping the strap of her camera bag like it could anchor her. No one was waiting. But beneath the nerves and the ache was something else, a quiet ache she couldn't name. Not loneliness, not fear. It was the hope, the foolish, flickering hope that somewhere out there, someone might see her as more than kind. That maybe, just maybe, someone would stay. She had left behind the girl who was always gentle, always good, and always overlooked. And maybe, just maybe, Denver would be the place where someone saw her not as safe, but as unforgettable. The second time she saw him, he was standing outside the same cafe, brushing snow off his coat sleeve with the kind of patience that seemed to belong to another era. Charlotte hadn't planned on going back to Pine and Steam that afternoon, but the gray sky and the cold that crept into her bones had pulled her there like a familiar scent. She hadn't expected to see him again, and certainly not twice more that week. The third time, he held the door for her. "We've got to stop meeting like this," he said, a flicker of a smile in his voice. "Or maybe we're supposed to," she replied, not knowing where the courage came from. He smiled fully this time. It was quiet and soft, the kind of smile that stayed a little while, even after it faded. They shared a corner table. She drank mint tea. He drank black coffee with nothing in it. She told him she was still learning to love the city. He said the city was never his to love. That's when he mentioned the cabin. "I live about 40 minutes up the mountain," he said casually, like it wasn't a big deal. Not many neighbors, no noise. A view that makes you forget time. Charlotte raised her eyebrows, only half teasing. "So, you're a recluse in a flannel shirt." He laughed an honest, chest-deep laugh. Something like that. "I work remotely, and I guess I like the quiet more than I expected. It's not for everyone, but it keeps me grounded." Then, as she reached for her scarf, he added almost offhand, "If you ever want to photograph wild elk, they wander near the clearing behind my place this time of year. Thought you might like that." Charlotte paused. Her fingers stilled on the fringe of her scarf. It wasn't the offer itself that gave her pause. It was everything that came with it, the idea of being alone in the woods with a man she barely knew, the kind of decision women were always taught to think twice about. But when she looked at him, really looked, she didn't feel fear. There was no pressure in his voice, no leaning in, just a simple invitation, one she could take or leave, and in his eyes, not expectation, only understanding. The following Saturday, just after dawn, she found herself climbing into his weathered blue Jeep. It smelled faintly of pine needles and worn leather. Miles drove with one hand on the wheel, his thermos balanced between his knees, the road curling higher and higher like ribbon. They spoke little during the drive. She watched the world shift outside her window, buildings giving way to trees, gray pavement turning to snow-packed dirt roads. Somewhere around mile 20, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long beams of gold across the mountaintops. By the time they reached the cabin, Charlotte felt like she'd stepped out of the life she knew and into something stillness had made. The cabin wasn't large, but it stood proudly dark wood, a sloped roof, a small wraparound porch dusted with snow. A pile of chopped firewood rested by the door. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, like a sigh of warmth waiting to welcome. Inside was even more surprising. It wasn't rustic or bare, it was lived in and kind. The scent of cedar and something faintly citrus lingered in the air. A stone fireplace glowed low in the corner, and beside it sat a small cast-iron stove, humming with quiet heat. On the mantel were framed photos, mountains in fog, a woman in a garden, a younger Miles beside an older man with matching eyes. Charlotte ran her hand gently over the edge of a nearby table oak, smooth from age and use. On it sat a delicate porcelain tea set, white with tiny blue flowers, clearly old and clearly cherished. "My mother's," Miles said, catching her glance. "She passed a few years ago. I don't use them much, but they make the place feel less empty." Charlotte nodded. She didn't say anything, but in that moment she felt something shift. Not between them, but in her. The kind of shift that comes when you realize someone knows how to live alone. Not because they don't need anyone, but because they once did. They spent the morning quietly. Miles led her through the woods behind the cabin, showing her where the elk usually passed. She took photos of antlers in the distance, of trees covered in hoarfrost, of a pair of birds huddled together on a branch. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't fill silences. He just walked beside her, like it was the most natural thing in the world. When they returned to the cabin, he made tea in the porcelain set, careful, reverent, almost ceremonial. They sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around the tiny cup, warmth seeping back into her fingers. Charlotte looked around the room, the low light, the hum of the stove, the shadows flickering across worn wood. "It feels like time slows down here," she said. Miles smiled, his eyes reflecting the fire. "That's the point." And in that silence, in that unspoken peace, she realized something that startled her. She wasn't afraid, not of the cabin, not of being alone with him, not even of the quiet. Because in that place, under that roof, she felt something she hadn't in years, safe. The snow outside the cabin had thickened. It wasn't loud, just persistent. Gentle flakes falling without sound, like time itself had decided to pause and rest. Inside, the fire had dimmed to a soft glow. Shadows danced on the walls like old memories, and the warmth made Charlotte drowsy in that way only deep trust can allow. She sat cross-legged on the worn rug by the hearth, her hands wrapped around another cup of tea, now half forgotten. Miles was only a few feet away, flipping through an old photography book she'd mentioned earlier. And yet she could feel him, not his touch, his presence. It was steady, solid, comforting, and terrifying. Charlotte glanced over at him. His face was calm, lit by amber firelight. Something about him didn't match the world she came from. He didn't rush to fill silence, didn't mistake closeness for permission, didn't pull at things not freely given. She looked away quickly, then drew her knees up, hugging them lightly. "I've never done this before," she said quietly, not quite knowing what she meant until the words left her mouth. Miles looked up from the book, eyes soft. "This, any of it," she whispered, "driving up a mountain with a man I barely know, sitting in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, feeling safe and unsure all at once." He didn't interrupt. He let her speak. "I'm not scared of you," she added, her voice barely audible. "I'm scared I'll lose myself, that I'll stop knowing where I end and someone else begins." She set the tea down. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the kind of honesty that left a person exposed. "I know that probably sounds silly. I've spent most of my life being the girl who made others feel comfortable. I was the one who stayed soft when the world turned hard. And I guess somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be close without giving too much." Her voice cracked at the edges, but she didn't cry. Instead, she laughed a breathless, almost embarrassed sound. "God, I sound like a Hallmark card." "No," Miles said gently. "You sound like someone who's learned how much love can cost." He stood slowly, walked to the coat rack, and took down a wool throw. He didn't sit next to her, didn't reach for her. He simply draped the blanket gently over her shoulders, the way someone might cover a sleeping child on a cold night. "Then I'll stay here," he said, kneeling beside her, close enough to share warmth, but not so close it took any away. "Right here, until you feel safe." Charlotte looked at him, then really looked. There was no hunger in his eyes, no expectation, only patience and kindness and something rare, restraint. "Do you always know when to stop?" she asked, her voice small. "No," he said with a soft smile. "I just know I'd rather wait a lifetime than take something not freely given." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. The fire popped softly, and for a long stretch, they said nothing. And then, as if remembering herself, she whispered, "Go slow. I'm a pure-hearted girl. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a test. It was a truth, soft, scared, and whole." Miles didn't answer with words. Instead, he stood, added another log to the fire, and returned to his seat across the room, giving her space, giving her time, giving her choice. He flipped open the book again, eyes scanning pages, but not really reading. Charlotte sat in silence, letting the warmth soak into her skin, the weight of the blanket grounding her. She felt seen, not spotlighted, not judged, just seen, for who she was, for what she needed. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like she had to apologize for being tender, for hesitating, for needing things to move slowly. Because maybe the right person wasn't the one who swept you off your feet, but the one who sat beside you, quietly, until you were ready to stand. The next morning, the snow was deeper. Charlotte stood at the small window in the cabin's kitchen, watching flakes drift lazily from the sky. The world outside was hushed in white, still, almost sacred. She wrapped her hands around a warm mug of coffee Miles had brewed strong, slightly bitter, but grounding. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He was sitting across the table, barefoot, reading a folded newspaper from 2 days ago. There was no rush, no noise to cut through. And for once, silence didn't feel like something to fill. It felt like something they could share. Later. She sat cross-legged by the fire, her camera in her lap, flipping slowly through her old photo files. Most of them weren't anything special. Grainy shots of alleyways, reflections in puddles, a stray cat caught mid-leap, the worn hands of her mother threading a needle. But she remembered each one. "I used to take photos just to prove I existed," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet like a leaf falling in water. Miles looked up. "There were nights in Denver," she continued, "when I felt like I was disappearing. I'd come home to a room that wasn't mine, eat soup from a can, and just scroll through these pictures. It reminded me that I'd seen beauty, that I'd caught it, that I was still here." She wasn't crying, but her voice held that soft ache people carry when they're not sure if anyone ever really saw how hard they tried to survive. Miles nodded slowly. "You took photos to stay whole," he said gently. "I think I did." He leaned back in his chair, stretching one arm across the worn wood. The fire crackled behind her. "I used to draw floor plans when I couldn't sleep," he said. "Made up houses I knew I'd never build." "Why?" "Because it made sense. The walls, the lines. If you followed the blueprint, things stayed standing." She tilted her head. "But not everything does." He nodded. "No. Some things fall apart anyway." She didn't ask, but he offered it. Her name was Sarah. He said, eyes distant but voice steady. "We were engaged, had a venue picked, cake tasted, rings engraved, everything." Charlotte didn't move. She just listened. 3 weeks before the wedding, she said she couldn't do it, that she didn't know how to love someone who always lived inside his own head. "And were you?" "Maybe," he said. "But I think I was just quiet, thoughtful, not the kind of man who fills rooms with sound. She needed more noise, I guess." Charlotte nodded slowly, understanding more than she expected to. "After that, I stopped returning calls, stopped going to birthdays, even Christmas. I just needed out from all of it. So you came here. I built this place myself. Took me 6 months. Hauled lumber through the snow. Slept in a tent some nights. Didn't care. It was mine." The silence returned then, but this time it was different. Not lonely, not sad. It was something in between healing and remembering. Charlotte looked at him, really looked. This man who'd learned how to live without being needed, who built walls not to keep people out, but to keep himself safe. Just like she had. They were strangers once. Now they were witnesses to each other's quiet pain, to each other's choice to keep showing up anyway. The wind picked up outside, shaking soft flurries off the pine branches. Charlotte reached for a blanket and draped it across both of their legs as she sat down beside him on the small couch. They didn't touch hands, didn't lock eyes for long. They just sat. And it was enough. She looked into the fire and said softly, "I used to think love had to arrive loudly, like thunder, like music. Now I think maybe it's more like this." "Like what?" "Like sitting with someone in silence and knowing neither of you wants to leave." Miles smiled, a small, warm thing. "Then I guess we're learning how to stay." She leaned her head gently against the side of the couch, not into him, just near him, and he didn't move. Outside, the wind howled, the trees shifted, the world kept turning. But inside the cabin, time softened its grip, and 2 people who once believed they had to heal alone found something stronger in the quiet. Not passion, not fireworks, but presence. And presence, Charlotte thought, was more rare than love. The day after the snowstorm. Charlotte sat alone in the cabin's reading nook, a small bench beneath the window, wrapped in a plaid blanket, the scent of pine still lingering from the logs Miles had chopped that morning. He'd gone outside to fix the shed door that had come loose in the wind. Said it wouldn't take long. said to make herself comfortable. But her heart wasn't. She hadn't planned to look. Truly, she hadn't. Her phone buzzed with weak signal, just long enough to load a single email. A message from her photography professor in Denver, checking in, asking how her time away was going. "If you're still on that break in the Rockies," he wrote, "you should visit the Anderson Retreat Center. It's run by a former CEO who disappeared from New York 5 years ago." Wild story. Charlotte's heart skipped. Anderson. She hesitated, then typed 2 words into the search bar. Miles Anderson. What filled the screen made her breath catch. He wasn't just a CEO, he was the CEO. Miles Anderson, founder of Novasite, a cutting-edge architecture tech firm once valued at over $200 million, featured in Forbes, Fast Company, and half a dozen glossy business profiles. Known for his clean vision, quiet confidence, and most notably vanishing just before a major acquisition deal. The articles speculated wildly. Burnout, breakdown, broken heart, but none of them had answers. Just breadcrumbs. Charlotte sat frozen. Her fingers trembled slightly. She didn't know what she expected to find, but it wasn't this. The man she'd spent nights sharing silence with. The man who fixed old hinges and made tea in a chipped kettle. He used to own skyscrapers. She stared out the window, watching him in the distance now, hammering gently at the shed frame, sleeves rolled, cheeks pink from the cold. Who am I in that world? The thought crept in quietly. Not bitter. Just honest. When Miles came back inside, snowflakes still clinging to his hair, he paused as soon as he saw her face. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with eyes full of questions she didn't know how to ask. He set down the toolbox, wiped his hands on a towel, and sat across from her. "You found out?" She nodded. He didn't flinch. "I wondered how long it would take." He said simply. Charlotte swallowed. "Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know if it still mattered." That answer, gentle as it was, stung. "It does," she said quietly. "I know." There was a long pause, the kind that carries weight. Then he leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, eyes not pleading, just open. "I wasn't running from her," he said, voice low. "I was running from who I became when I was with her." Charlotte didn't interrupt. She loved the success. He continued, "The press, the power, the events, and I thought if I just worked harder, gave more, maybe I'd feel like I belonged in that world. But every time I climbed higher, I felt smaller, more hollow." His jaw tensed, not with anger, with memory. One day, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man in the suit. Sharp, impressive, exhausted. I didn't like him. I didn't trust him. He looked at her now. So I left. Everything. The board, the bonus, the building. I cashed out my shares, disappeared, and came here. I built a cabin with my own hands because I needed to remember what real things felt like again. Charlotte blinked back, a strange ache. It wasn't envy. It wasn't awe. It was something in between. "You live like none of that ever happened," she said softly, "because it doesn't define me anymore." She looked down at her hands. "But it's part of you, just like my past is part of me." He nodded. "Yes, and that's why I'm telling you now, because I don't want you to feel small next to me. I've been small in bigger rooms than this." Charlotte let out a shaky breath. "I'm not scared of you," she said. "I'm scared of how much I want to trust you, because if I do, and I'm wrong, it'll cost me more than I can afford." The words surprised even her, but Miles didn't shrink from them. He just nodded. "Then we'll go slow," he said. "I'll match your pace, not because you're fragile, but because you matter." Outside, the sun dipped behind the mountain ridge, casting soft golden light across the snow. Inside, two people sat in the quiet once again. And, for the first time, Charlotte didn't feel like she was standing in someone else's story. She felt like she was being invited into it. The invitation came on a Tuesday. A handwritten note slid under Charlotte's teacup just as she returned from the woods with her camera cheeks flushed, boots muddy. "My father wants to meet you," it read. Friday night, Aspen, dinner, no flourish, no pressure, just black ink on cream paper neat, unshaken. But her heart pounded anyway. Friday arrived with a nervous kind of sunlight, too bright for snow, too quiet for comfort. Charlotte stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple navy dress she'd borrowed from Miles's late mother's closet, one of the few garments he'd kept. The silk felt too fine for her skin. Her curls didn't settle the way they did in the mountains. Her hands kept fidgeting. "You look like yourself," Miles whispered behind her, watching her through the reflection. "That's all I want." She nodded, even though part of her didn't believe it. "Not tonight." Aspen shimmered like a world untouched by hardship. The Anderson estate sat on a hill above the town, glass and stone framed in gold evening light. It was elegant, painfully so. Every line of the architecture was crisp, commanding, like the man who had designed it. They were met at the door by a housekeeper who greeted Miles with a quiet nod. Charlotte noticed the way Miles's shoulders squared as they entered a subtle shift. Not fear, exactly, but readiness. Like a man preparing to walk into a version of himself he thought he'd buried. The dining room was glowing with soft amber light. Candles flickered against crystal, silver, porcelain, a table set for 4, though only 3 seats were filled. Miles's father sat at the head, Leonard Anderson, tall, silver-haired, still sharp-jawed and clear-eyed despite his age. A presence that filled the room like perfume expensive and impossible to ignore. "You're late," he said evenly as they entered. "Good to see you too." "Dad," Miles replied, the faintest edge in his voice. Leonard stood, offering Charlotte a firm, almost obligatory handshake. No warmth, no welcome, just civility, perfectly measured. "Charlotte," he said, "so you're the one who convinced my son to trade steel for snow." She forced a polite smile. "Not my intention, sir. Rarely is." Dinner was served in silence for several minutes. Soft classical music played from a hidden speaker system, something orchestral, precise. The meal itself was exquisite roasted duck, wild mushroom risotto, wine that cost more than her camera. Charlotte tried to focus on her plate, on her posture, on remembering which fork was which. But she could feel his eyes on her, judging, calculating, as if trying to find the flaw that would confirm his assumption. Finally, Leonard spoke. "So, Charlotte," he said, laying down his fork, "are you here to be a wife, or to fix his loneliness?" The words dropped like stones into a still lake. The music, the candlelight, even the warmth in the room seemed to freeze. Charlotte's breath caught. Miles looked up sharply. "Excuse me." Leonard didn't flinch. "Your sudden return to the surface." "Miles, your appearances in town, the smiling, the guests, it's all very performative. So I ask again, is she here to build a life, or just to fill the void you couldn't manage alone?" Charlotte said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat tightened, and for the first time since she arrived in the mountains, she wanted to run. Not because she was weak, but because she suddenly saw it how people like Leonard saw people like her. Not as equals, not as women with histories and hearts, but as placeholders. She looked down at her hands in her lap. They were trembling, and before she could excuse herself, disappear into the marble hallway. Miles moved. He stood, gently, slowly, the chair leg scraping softly against the hardwood. Then he reached for her hand, fingers curling firmly around hers, anchoring her. "She's not here to fix me," he said, voice clear, even. "She came because I finally feel like myself again. Isn't that enough?" His father blinked, perhaps not expecting resistance. "You've always been impulsive." "Miles." "No," Miles said. "I've been silent, but not anymore." He turned to Charlotte now. "You don't owe this room anything. Not proof, not apology, not a performance." She looked up at him then, and something broke, not in her, but around her. The spell, the doubt, the belief that she would never be enough for a room like this. They left before dessert. Miles didn't wait for approval, didn't glance back. The cold air outside wrapped around them as they stepped onto the front steps, hand in hand. Charlotte exhaled for the first time all evening. "I didn't mean to embarrass you," she whispered. "You didn't," he said, but he did. They walked in silence to the car, halfway down the driveway, past sculpted hedges and frozen fountains. She turned to him. "You really meant what you said, that you feel more like yourself. With me. I do. Even after tonight, especially after tonight." She looked down at their entwined hands. Then, "Don't let me go." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His hand only tightened around hers gently. Certainly, like a promise. The morning after Aspen, the mountains were shrouded in mist. Charlotte stood by the cabin window, wrapped in a wool shawl, her suitcase by the door. Outside, the pine trees swayed gently, their branches dusted with snow from the night before. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Miles was still asleep upstairs. She hadn't slept at all. She'd spent the night folding and unfolding a single photograph. It was one she had taken by accident. A week ago, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Miles had been stacking firewood by the shed. She had called his name. He'd turned around, and in that split second, something caught the light, not just in his eyes, but in his whole face. He was laughing, free. She'd clicked the shutter without thinking. That photo now lay beside a handwritten letter, both placed gently on the wooden kitchen table. The ink on the letter was still drying. Charlotte didn't leave with anger. She didn't leave with bitterness or blame. She left with love, the kind of love that knows when to step back. She walked through the cabin one last time, tucked the blanket neatly on the couch, rinsed her tea mug, straightened the photo frames on the mantel. Everything she touched, she left better than she found it, and then, with fingers that trembled only slightly, she opened the door. The cold met her softly, like the mountain was trying to hold her still. But she kept walking. Upstairs. Miles stirred. His hand reached for the space beside him, empty. He sat up slowly, sensing the silence before he saw the truth. Downstairs, the house felt too still, too intact. When he saw the envelope and the photo on the table, he knew. He picked up the picture first. His own face smiled back, unguarded, sunlit, alive. Then, with a hand heavy and slow, he opened the letter. "Miles, you once told me you didn't recognize the man in the suit. But in this photo, I recognize you completely. That's the version of you I fell in love with. The one who made tea slowly, who listened without needing to fix anything, who stood beside me in silence until I felt safe. But after Aspen, I saw the version of you that still belongs to a world I will never fit inside. Maybe someday you'll stop trying to bridge two lives that don't want to meet. I want to be loved fully, not hidden in the shadows of your legacy. Don't come after me, not because I don't love you, but because I do. And I want that love to stay honest, even if it has to live quietly, without a home. Charlotte Miles didn't move for a long time. The letter rested in his lap, the photo in his hands. The fire had gone cold, but he didn't light it again. Outside, snow began to fall soft, soundless. Somewhere beyond the trees, the woman who had taught him to feel again was walking away, not because she doubted him, but because she believed she deserved to be chosen fully, without condition. And he knew she was right. It had snowed all night. Denver lay under a blanket of white, thick and still, the kind that muffled everything, even the sound of your own thoughts. Charlotte sat by the small window of her rented room, watching flakes drift lazily past the glass. Her hands were wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. Her eyes, though open, saw nothing outside. It had been 6 days since she left the cabin. She hadn't touched her camera, hadn't spoken much to anyone. There are silences that echo louder than words, and this one lived in her chest, pulsing gently like an ache that wouldn't bruise. Then came the knock. Soft, steady. Not the rushed rhythm of delivery, nor the hesitant beat of a stranger. Charlotte opened the door slowly. There, standing against the backdrop of falling snow, was an older woman, tall, graceful, wrapped in a charcoal gray coat trimmed with fur. Her eyes were sharp but kind, weathered but warm. "You must be Charlotte," she said. Charlotte nodded, unsure. "Yes, I'm Margaret Anderson. Miles is my son." Time paused. Charlotte's breath caught. She blinked once, twice, not because she was shocked, but because she hadn't imagined this moment ever coming from her. Margaret held out a small envelope. "He wrote this the night you left, but he couldn't send it. He thought maybe I could." Charlotte took the letter with hands she tried to keep still. "He doesn't know I'm here," Margaret added gently. "But I'm his mother. I know when someone saves my son, then..." Without another word, she turned and walked back down the steps, disappearing into the snowfall like a scene from a dream. Charlotte stood there for a long moment before gently closing the door behind her. She sat back down by the window, the envelope cradled in her hands like something sacred. It was sealed. No address, just her name, Charlotte. Her name, in the handwriting she'd memorized steady, intentional, a little slanted. She opened it slowly. "Charlotte, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe that's why I can finally write it. I told myself you left because of my father, because of the room you didn't belong in. But I think you left because somewhere deep down, you believed I hadn't really chosen you. You didn't ask me to choose, but I chose you anyway, not out of rebellion, not out of anger, not because I was trying to prove something. I chose you because you're the only thing in my life that has ever felt completely, wholly, unquestionably true. You made me want to sit still. You made silence feel safe. You reminded me how much I'd hidden behind success and how little of it meant anything without someone to share it with. If you come back, I won't ask for explanations. I won't need them. I'll just hold the door open. If you don't, know this. You didn't disappear from my life. You became the center of it. M." Charlotte didn't cry right away. She read the letter twice, then a third time. Her hands didn't shake. Her heart didn't race. The tears came slowly, not from pain, not even from regret, but from the quiet breaking of a lifetime of not being chosen, of always being the kind girl, the nice girl, the friend, the safe one, never the one someone chose without hesitation. But this letter, every word had no performance in it, no grandeur. It was raw, uneven, honest, and somewhere between the sentence "you didn't ask me to choose" and the one that said, "but you became the center of it," she felt something crack and then rebuild itself inside her. The snow kept falling outside, but inside her small room, something had shifted. Not the air, not the light. Her. She folded the letter gently, not to hide it, but to hold it carefully, like something that could still grow. And for the first time in days, she reached for her camera. 1 year later, the same cabin stood quietly between the pines, its wooden beams weathered, its windows trimmed with frost, but the heart of it, the soul of it, had changed. It wasn't a place to run from anymore. It had become a place people came to begin again. Charlotte moved around the clearing with practiced ease. In her hand was a camera, the same one her father had given her, now lovingly restored. In her pocket was a folded tissue she never needed until after the ceremony. 2 young grooms stood barefoot in the snow-dusted grass, laughing nervously as golden light filtered through the trees. Charlotte gave them gentle directions, never posing them, just inviting them to be. Behind her, Miles piloted a small drone, carefully capturing the scene from above the mountains behind, the wildflowers poking through late spring frost, the glint of sunlight on 2 rings. They didn't charge anything for these weddings, only asked one thing: tell us the story of how you found each other. They called the project Light and Vow, a wedding studio for people who thought they'd never have one. When the ceremony ended, the couple hugged Charlotte and Miles like old friends. No tuxedos, no guests, just honest joy held between 2 hearts and a borrowed suit jacket. "You made us feel like we belong somewhere," one of them whispered. Charlotte smiled, blinking away warmth. "You already did. You just needed a photograph to prove it." That evening, after the clearing had emptied and the last beam of sunset slid through the trees, Charlotte returned to the cabin. The inside was exactly as it had always been. Pine walls, cast iron stove, her father's camera on the shelf, Miles' mother's teacups by the sink, a handmade quilt over the back of the couch. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, it was their wedding night. There had been no invitations, no gown, only a vow made in quiet and a decision that needed no witnesses but the trees and the stars. Charlotte stepped into the main room where Miles was adjusting the firewood. He turned as she entered and for a moment didn't speak. Her dress was soft, not white, but pale gray, with lace at the sleeves and a ribbon at her waist. Her curls were pinned loosely, and in her hands was a single photograph. The photo she took of him by the shed, sunlight on his face, the one she had left behind. She walked up to him slowly, placed the photo on the mantel, then took his hands in hers. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't have to go slow anymore," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm ready. All in." Miles didn't speak. He didn't have to. He pulled her into an embrace that said more than any vow. There was no music, no applause, just the sound of the fire crackling, and 2 hearts finally, completely, without hesitation, home. Later that night, they sat by the fire, wrapped in the old quilt, 2 mugs of tea untouched in their hands. Charlotte looked at him, quiet for a long while. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think love had to be earned, that I had to prove I was enough. Miles didn't interrupt. He just listened. She smiled, eyes glistening. But now I know. You don't have to be perfect to be loved, just honest enough to be seen. Outside, the stars blinked gently above the trees. Inside, the light from the fireplace bathed the room in a golden hush. And in that hush, love stayed. Not loudly, not grandly, but truly. As we grow older, life teaches us to measure worth by roles, achievements, or how much we can give others. But Charlotte's story gently reminds us of something more enduring. You don't have to be perfect to be loved, just honest enough to be seen. So many of us have spent decades caring for others, staying quiet, doing the right thing, all while wondering if anyone truly sees who we are beneath it all. Charlotte wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, but she was real. And in the quiet strength of her choices in walking away with dignity and returning with courage, she found a kind of love that didn't demand more than her truth. This story invites us to ask, are we still hiding parts of ourselves, thinking they're too simple to be loved? It's never too late to believe that love, deep, steady love, is still possible. Not the kind that tries to fix us, but the kind that sits quietly beside us and says, I see you, or you're enough. Whether you're 55 or 85, remember your heart hasn't aged out of being worthy. It just knows more clearly what it truly needs. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to our channel for more gentle, soul-stirring stories. Your support means more than you know. It helps us continue creating heartfelt content that brings comfort, healing, and hope. Until next time, take care, and never forget, you are enough.